and possibly good evening to everybody who's online now. I think we have critical mass to go ahead and get started. We've received quite a lot of interest in this event, which is great to see. I'll be your host today and your moderator. My name is Christopher Rice. I am the Research Translation Communication Lead at Indiana University and with Laser Pulse. So this is Laser Focused, our webinar series. Our objective with the series is to explore critical topics in international development, research translation, project management, by providing an interactive platform with our Laser Pulse network members. So today we're responding to our network members' interests by providing guidance on applying for USAID grants from the perspectives of researchers, practitioners, donors. This is a really broad topic, I know, applying for USAID grants in general, but we're hoping that this will be applicable for those who might be novices with USAID or might have just a small degree of experience with them. We're going to keep things broad to appeal to the whole network that we have, but we'll have opportunities to ask more specific questions in Q&A toward the end. Now, notably, this is part one of a two-part series. So next time we'll reconvene on September 14th. We'll be going over the managing side of USAID grants. I'll make sure to drop a link into the chat at some point during the time here today. So I see we're already doing this, but please go in and go ahead, introduce yourself in the chat, put your name, your affiliation, get some discussion going on in the chat. Feel free to submit any questions that you have. Go ahead and submit them now or throughout as they pop into your head. My colleague, Harry Dedong, will be monitoring. And then before we get started, just for anyone who might not be as familiar with Laser Pulse, so we are a $70 million program funded through USAID's Innovation Technology and Research Hub to deliver research-driven solutions to field source development challenges all around the world. So we have some wonderful partners, Catholic Relief Services, Purdue University, Indiana University, University of Notre Dame, and then Makerere University in Uganda. What we've done with our partners over the last few years is set up this expanding network of currently 3,000 researchers and practitioners across the world. We've worked to identify research needs and issue subsequent funding cycles, where we have a portfolio currently of about 40 projects that are responding to development needs all around the world. And we work to ensure the projects in the network that we have opportunities for capacity strengthening in embedded research translation and also gender mainstreaming along the way. So today, we're lucky enough to be joined by a really diverse set of panelists, a wonderful array of panelists from USAID, from Purdue University and Catholic Relief Services, to share their experiences in applying for USAID grants that hopefully can get our network members going moving forward. So our panelists that we have here today, and as I'm introducing you, please just keep turning your video, wave, say hi. First off, I'll introduce Matthew Johnson, who is the USAID Industry Liaison and Communications Director at the Office of Acquisition and Assistance. So he helps to connect and engage with organizations around doing business with USAID, leading initiatives such as the creation of workwithusaid.org that you'll hear more about later, the agency's business forecast, their acquisition and assistance strategy, and the new partnerships initiative. Welcome, Matt. And we also have Dr. Maggie Leineck, who currently works at USAID as a senior scientist and program officer in the Innovation Technology and Research Hub. She focuses on sourcing, piloting, and scaling research and technology innovations as part of the Higher Education Solutions Network. Maggie is very familiar to us here at Laser, as well as our sister projects. Thank you, Maggie, for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
We also have Dr. Arvind Raman, who is the principal investigator and director of the Laser Pulse program, also the executive associate dean for the College of Engineering and the Robert V. Adams Professor of Mechanical Engineering at Purdue University. Arvind is the co-founder of the Shaw Family Global Innovation Lab and has co-authored over 140 peer-reviewed journal articles. Thank you, Arvind. And last but of course not least is Beth Carroll, who is the Chief of Party for Catholic Relief Services Haiti on their resilience and food security activity that translates to a stronger Haiti. She has over 15 years of experience in resiliency, sustainability, and community engagement, 25 years of experience as a senior manager, and then a lot of other experience as well in pre-positioning and resource mobilization for quite a multitude of donors that of course includes USAID. So welcome to our panelists for joining us here today. Thank you all. Now, we're going to get started with a very short presentation. Many of us on the call are really curious about some of the best practices in applying for USAID grants or just how to get started in the first place. So Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you for a quick presentation where hopefully you can explain to our participants why they should partner with USAID and apply for USAID funding. How do you know if you're in a good place to apply for funding, and how can participants learn more just about what's available in the ecosystem? Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to try and in just a couple of short minutes talk, some of the high-level overview stuff of how to work with USAID. I'll also maybe when I'm done talking, drop a bunch of links into the chat box just to share additional resources. And then our team also does sort of hour-long sessions similar to this, kind of diving a little bit deeper into some of these topics. But I want to, I guess, just kind of cover things from a very high-level overview about sort of how to find funding opportunities or where funding opportunities exist within USAID. So to be a direct partner with USAID, or oftentimes what we call a prime partner, all of our funding opportunities are really posted in two websites, sam.gov and grants.gov. sam.gov is where we post all of our contracts, activities. I think most of you probably on this call are mostly interested in sort of what's going to be posted on grants.gov, but an acquisition or a contract is something where USAID is sort of purchasing a good or service to either implement an activity or purchasing, tents, supplies, shelters, those sort of goods or services. You have a requirement within USAID and actually across the entire federal government that all both contracts as well as grants over $150,000 are required to be posted on these two websites. So if you're wondering sort of where to find things, these are really the two key places to look. The one I think you're probably the most interested in is posted what's called on grants.gov, or what we at USAID call assistance. So USAID has a number of grant programs as well as something we call a cooperative agreement, which is somewhere kind of between a mixture between a grant and a contract. We're giving you funding to implement an activity, but we're going to have a substantial level of involvement kind of in that activity overall. But for most of you, I think as academic institution organizations are probably most interested in working with us realistically through a grant or a cooperative agreement. And all of those activities are posted on grants.gov. You can go into grants.gov today and see, any handful number of activities that are currently available on the website. But just, at a very high level, that's where all of our grant as well as cooperative agreement opportunities are posted if you're interested in kind of taking a look at them. But before we even get to the point of posting things on grants.gov or sam.gov, one of the most important tools I want to highlight to you is something called a USAID business forecast. We have an internal planning system that all of our staff around the world use to basically track every upcoming activity that we're planning on doing around the world in the 100+ countries that we operate in. The business forecast really gives you sort of like this snapshot of advanced look. Hey, in 6 months, we're going to be looking for organizations in Kenya to do education work, or this is a particular one, an economic growth and trade program in Colombia that we're going to be looking at doing later on in the year. You can see here a snapshot of this equitable finance program, is sort of a snapshot of the type of information you see that's available on our business forecast. The forecast is updated daily, like I said, pulling from our internal planning systems. Last time I looked, I think there's about 260 upcoming funding opportunities on the business forecast. And so really the forecast is used as a tool to help you kind of plan and map out different funding opportunities, different ways to get engaged within the agency. And so we encourage folks to kind of take a look at the forecast on a regular basis. You can see the link here. It's just usaid.gov/business-forecast. There's a host of information on there. One of the other things, I'll drop a link into the chat box after this, is that our team hosts sort of a quarterly, what we call business forecast conference call, where we invite organizations to share questions with us on any upcoming funding opportunity they have, or kind of general questions about how to work with USAID. On these calls, we typically get about 1,000 questions, and we answer all of them in writing and post them on our website. You can see, if you go to the business forecast website, you can see our most recent business forecast call. And so as you're looking at things on the business forecast, it's really an opportunity for you to engage both with USAID around specific funding opportunities, as well as kind of get a snapshot of what's coming up for USAID sort of down the future. I think one of the things within USAID, I think one of the challenges, we oftentimes have so many organizations coming to us, we're sort of like, we don't know quite how we're going to engage with you, how to work with you. But one of the great things about the business forecast is you can say, hey, I see that, in Colombia, you guys are getting ready to do an equitable finance program. We've got a lot of experience in this area. So you can reach out to the point of contact that's listed on the business forecast, Paula, or you can reach out to me and my team, and we can help kind of make those connections, facilitate those connections. I think as you think about working with USAID, sometimes it's often helpful to have sort of a tangible program or activity as a way of engaging or connecting with USAID. So like I said, encourage you to take a look at the business forecast, and can drop a link to it in the chat box just in a moment. One of the other things that I do want to mention, so USAID doesn't have a lot of traditional grant programs like you maybe see in other government agencies. We don't get these large pots of funds where you can anyone can apply. We get this money on an annual basis. Kind of the way USAID works is we have long-term strategies in every country that we work in. We sort of design programs and activities, and then we look for organizations to help support those. However, we do have a couple of small kind of grant programs or programs that I think you may be particularly interested in as sort of academic institutions. The first one is a program called our Development Innovation Ventures program, or the DIV program. The DIV program is a really great way to kind of test and scale new ideas around development challenges. If you go to usaid.gov/div, you can learn a little bit more about the process. But through the DIV program, it's a simplified application, sort of a standard application that you provide to USAID. And then there's different level of fundings if it's sort of getting a new idea, concept off the ground to scaling an activity. So I think it ranges anywhere between $150,000 to upwards of a couple $1 million. The DIV program is a really great program if you're new to trying to work with USAID, or if you are our researcher or innovator and has sort of a new idea that you want to test around the world. So I encourage you to take a look at the DIV program. The DIV program has a pot of funds that's set aside that we get from our Congress every year. The second is an initiative called the New Partnerships Initiative. And one of the things I think for this is the New Partnerships Initiative really simplifies the process of applying for funding to USAID. So USAID will have specific funding opportunities that are specifically set aside for new partners or newer organizations as a way to kind of more easily connect and engage and work with USAID. Through the New Partnerships Initiative, we'll request concept notes around specific ideas or activities. One of the largest activities we've had under the New Partnerships Initiative is actually a higher education program. It's called the Helix program. I can drop a link to that in the chat box as well. And there's been a number of funding opportunities around the world kind of through the New Partnerships Initiative. Another program just for you to take a look at is our American Schools and Hospitals Abroad program. As you can see here, it's really focused on providing assistance to overseas schools and libraries. We do see a number of academic institutions, I think, working with us through that program. But then I think just more generally, one of the areas that's something to take a look at if you're looking at things on grants.gov, I would look for activities that are specifically called something like an annual program statement. An annual program statement is sort of USAID setting goals or objectives for a year in a specific sector, area, or country that we want to work in. And then there are specific funding opportunities that are issued through what's called a round or addendum. But one of the reasons I want to point this specific one, an APS or an annual program statement out to you, is that it really simplifies the process to working with USAID. If any of you have ever applied for funding from USAID, it's oftentimes a bit of a complicated process with many pages of documents we require to be submitted. But under an annual program statement, oftentimes it's just a simple 3 to 5 page concept note that we ask upfront. And then if it's something that we like, then we kind of engage and connect with you directly and kind of walk through the entire kind of grant making process, sort of hand in hand through a process we call co-creation. So I wanted to highlight that program. And then just a quick note, I think on registration, I think this is a question we get a lot. I'm happy to talk about this more. So in order to be able to receive any U.S. government funding, organizations have to be registered in SAM.gov and have a unique entity ID. This is a new process as of April of this year, but you have to be registered in SAM.gov before you submit a full application to USAID. So that would be a full request for proposal or request for application. The one caveat to that, if you're looking at submitting just a concept note to USAID, you can submit a concept note but not be registered. But by the time we would obviously plan to work with you or give you any kind of grant or funding, you would have to be registered in SAM. So, one of the things you want to look at for your organizations or your universities to see whether or not you are already registered. I know many US-based universities are already registered, but this is important information you to have access to. And then the second is just a CAGE or in-CAGE code. If you're overseas, you have to be registered with the in-CAGE code. And then domestically, actually, if you get registered in SAM, you automatically get a CAGE code. But these are really the only two registration requirements sort of within all of USAID to get US government funding. And then just real quick before I turn it back over, I do want to highlight a new website. Chris mentioned this early on. We just launched this website this past year called workwithusaid.org. It's really set up as a tool for you to help you in your sort of partnership journey of working with USAID. Two things I just want to highlight real quick. One of the things we do is we have a partner directory. We invite organizations to add their names, organizations to our directory. And we use it within USAID. It's a place to kind of do market research to understand different organizations, who they are, where they're working, what types of sectors they're working in. Organizations that are already working with USAID also do it, use it to look for sub-partners and sub-organizations to work with. But then even you as organizations, if you're interested in working in Timor-Leste, for example, you can go on here and identify all the organizations that are currently working with USAID or that are working in Timor-Leste, for example, and potentially connect with them. So we encourage you to add your organization to the partner directory if you're not already in here. It's a really helpful tool. And then the other thing I'll just highlight is something called our pre-engagement assessment. If you're totally new to working with USAID or the US government, we have a simple 48-question assessment. I say simple, it takes about 15 minutes to do. But the assessment takes you through a number of things, which is like, what is your experience in managing US government funding, compliance, program management, budget, finance. But once you take the assessment, we actually give you a customized report for your organization that directs you to additional trainings or resources. So example, we have a step-by-step guide on our website for how to get registered within SAM.gov. Do you get a unique entity ID? So if you identify in this assessment that you aren't registered, we'll direct you to that specific resource and training. So just want to highlight this. There's also a library. We have an events page, all sorts of blogs that we're issuing, and then as well as direct links to the business forecast, grants.gov and SAM.gov. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And then just finally, I'll drop all these links into the chat box. One of the things my team is really set up to be a front door to USAID for any organizations that are interested in partnering with us. We do a lot of one-on-one consultations with organizations. We do a lot of events. We also post sort of all of the daily funding opportunities on our LinkedIn page, as well as Twitter and Facebook. So if you're on any of those channels, I encourage you to follow our stuff. So that was a very, very fast, high-level overview of kind of how to work with USAID. So I'll stop there and turn it back and welcome questions as we get further into the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And as mentioned earlier, any questions that you might have for Matt, please do go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll get to them a little bit later in the hour. The first question I want to direct to Maggie, who's on our panel here. Maggie, just reacting to what we've seen from Matt, as kind of just the standard approach for engaging with USAID and how to look at it now. What sorts of new trends are we seeing across opportunities now that others might not be aware of? So I know Matt mentioned the new partnerships initiative, things like locally led development or DEI or things like that. Specifically, of course, with your experiences in research, what kind of trends are you seeing?
So trends on that side of the question kind of fall in a couple different categories. One is we are definitely seeing and making sure that our teams are actively engaged in is co-creation. So building a little bit off of what Matt was talking about, it's not just how you apply and how you get access, but it's also the application process itself is changing. So we are looking a lot more at, how do you change something from, how do we work better with our partners during the process of, after a concept node and competition has occurred, but before an award is actually finalized and made, how do we work together in different ways so that we pull in different expertise, both from our potential new partner, but also the surrounding community around or stakeholders around that topic or area. And so bringing in those voices, getting, kind of assistance and things. So last fall, before our new awards were made, we went through a 10-week process, meeting once or twice a week for 10 weeks with our new partners, 3 of our new partners, and really built and dug into many of the fundamental questions around their proposed approach and the ideas. And, we had 2 weeks on budget. Budget often is one of the harder and more complex things for people, especially researchers, to figure out how exactly they build this giant or small budget, but all the pieces that need to come together for it. And so, it's those kind of things that come together, and really in the way that we're working together through co-creation is really changing, and I think will only continue to grow and be a part of more of our approaches writ large. When we think about the research side of this, and the trends that we're starting to see, we're really seeing there is, we are looking and pushing into certain areas at USAID. We're always trying to expand and evolve the way that we do business. And so those focus on things like, especially around research, on research and impact. So doing research on the bench, in the field, wherever it may be, writing beautiful research reports is great, but it's not enough anymore, right? We need to see those connections to policymakers, practitioners, decision makers that really take that research and do something impactful with it. And that could take a wide variety of things. And it's not an easy thing to accomplish. This is not something that you can just tack on to the end of a research project and expect to be successful. It's really something about embedding that and working that through. And Laser, I know, has several modules on kind of how and what to do about this, which I'm sure you all can point people to now that I've mentioned it. We didn't plan this, we probably should have. But that kind of thing about how research. The other thing that we're really seeing a huge strive for, and it matches up with the USAID's kind of push towards localization, new partner initiatives, things like that, is this, the desire for there to be local partners on these kinds of projects, and for capacity both directions, if it's a US or even not US institution, to a developing country institution, whether it's a university or other types of organizations that do this practitioner work, things like that, is really, how can that partnership be actually built as a partnership? And over the course of a project, can we move towards having built enough capacity with all partners so that people can continue this kind of work, whether it's sustainability or other ways in other parts? So thanks for the question.
Thank you, Maggie. That's great. I'd like to direct our next question over to Arvin and to Beth. So before you even think about applying for a USAID grant or any kind of funding opportunity, from the perspective of a researcher and then also from a practitioner, what do you need to consider or know or just have in your back pocket before you even apply? And why would you go for USAID to fund your work as opposed to another donor? And Arvin, I think let's start with you.
Yeah, and I'm going to maybe take the lens of a higher education institution looking at USAID opportunities. Now, I would say that USAID, working with USAID, offers a very unique venue for impact of one's scholarship or teaching or extension activities, right? So we do all these things in universities, and the impact of it, can potentially be local. Maybe it doesn't go as far, but when partnering with USAID, it offers a mega stage. The world becomes the stage, right? And you're talking about scale at which, it's very hard to imagine how the work you do might have an impact on others. So I would argue that first and foremost reason for working with USAID from higher education institutions is amplifying impact of what one does in higher education institutions, whether it's just research or education or extension. But I would just say that generally speaking, before even thinking about it, I sort of see it as a decision node point that if perhaps the institution has not had significant prior history of receiving and managing USAID awards versus a case where the institution has had that experience. And so I think of it as a point where you can kind of, even before you think about it, there are these two things to think about. In the former case, when perhaps an institution has not had significant prior history of partnering with USAID, I would suggest that probably the option is going to be not to go for a bid oneself, but partner and be a sub-awardee in some way, right? And there are things that universities, for example, can do intentionally to position themselves for being a partner of choice to those that are best positioned to go ahead and lead such award mechanisms. Matt already talked about looking up, work with USAID, looking at implementing partners. If you find in the country that you have partnerships in where you know people, where the scope of a potential USAID program lies, very well in that area in which your institution has expertise, then looking up, what are those organizations that are actually implementing USAID programs already is a great place to start and build relationships with them and connections. For our case at Purdue, leading up to LASER, we had several years, for example, of a partnership with Catholic Relief Services that really helped us engage and understand, what are the opportunities where we as a university might bring in research and extension value to those who implement such programs where we could be sub-awardees, for example. So that I think is very important. Reaching out to the POC on these upcoming business forecast is another way. I would highly encourage institutions that haven't received significant USAID funding yet to consider building a capacity statement, a one-pager where you really highlight what are those things that you bring to the table relevant for development in the country you're working in that line up with USAID interests in that country, that you can easily communicate, what's your experience, what you can offer that's different, and share that with any connections that come your way, either through the POC on the business forecast or by looking at partners on workwithusaid.org. And of course, you do want to make sure you're able to receive US government funding. And so all those things become important when you think about how do you partner as a sub-awardee if you don't have prior USAID experience. Now, if you do have prior USAID experience, what we have found is from a higher education institution, the go, no-go decision on whether one chooses to go for an application or not is often very complex and multifaceted. You are looking for programs. First of all, you always want to be looking at business forecast, and that's the place you go from. Look every day, make it a point. You come in first thing in work, take a look at what's new, and you will occasionally find that there are programs in countries where maybe in your own country where you have great partnerships already, and the program scope, pretty closely aligns with expertise that you have within the institution. So based on the business forecast, hopefully 6 months before, the NOFO or the RFP is issued, is the time for you to start reaching out to these other partners that you've developed, whether it's NGOs or other higher education institutions who have led such programs before, to really decide whether you want to partner or go in for it yourself as a prime. And I think that decision really hinges on many criteria. Is there alignment with the university mission? Within the university, do you have buy-in and support all the way up to the top of the administration that are supportive of you going after? Because it's going to take a lot of resources and a lot of effort. I think it's important to be sure that you have enough prior experience in that technical sector and in that area of the world. And the bottom line is, do you have people who are fired up? As much as these things match, if you don't have the right person to lead the bid, then it's probably not going to work out. So these are some factors that I think higher education institutions end up taking when they choose to go after a bid and have prior USAID experience. And so that's what I wanted to add, Chris.
Thank you, Arvind. Beth, over to you. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. That was a very complete answer. So I'll just build a little bit from an implementer perspective. And really what Arvin just said is very accurate. I think what we're really looking at is the opportunities that exist, what's out there. As Matt said early on, USAID doesn't have a lot of opportunities that are open pots, money that anybody can apply for. When they're publishing opportunities, they have certain objectives or certain goals in mind. And so the first thing that we look at is really how do those align with our priorities, our sectors of expertise, our interests. As an organization, again, I think we've already spoken to this, but really being able to understand how our current in-country partners, the local voices and actors that we work with, how they're prioritized, how they're included, how the program, like how this opportunity or the eventual program could benefit those relationships. The other thing that I'll mention, again, these are all things that have all been mentioned already, but the other thing I'll add is, as an implementer, we really do focus on opportunities that provide a little bit more flexibility. So you would probably see CRS applying more for cooperative agreements or grants rather than contracts, so that we have the flexibility to be able to really focus on those priorities where we have expertise. Just maybe another point that I would add is when you're thinking about going in for an opportunity, being able to understand and have a very honest perspective on where are your expertise, what relationships do you have that you can leverage, because these are very competitive processes. We wouldn't want to invest the energy and resources, especially those motivated people, on opportunities that we don't feel like we have a reasonable chance of winning. So we want to make sure that we're honest with ourselves about what we're bringing to the table. And if we see gaps, being proactive and identifying if it's a local actor, if it's a research partner, if it's a technical specialist that would help us strengthen our application, and really make sure that we are competitive going in. And again, as Arvin mentioned, there are times when we look at opportunities and we see that perhaps the full opportunity doesn't align with our priorities, but that there are sections of it that are very important to us. So for example, if we have a prior interest in working with entrepreneur opportunities for young people, but the opportunity that is posted by USAID has a much larger perspective, then we would then approach other partners who would maybe want a prime, where we could play that role of the partner who's specifically focusing on that priority. So really the main point for us is trying to be very clear on what USAID is looking for, understanding how it aligns to what we want to be doing and what we can do, and what we can demonstrate to USAID that we would be effective at doing.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Beth. We've heard quite a bit about partnerships so far, so I want to make sure we have ample time to talk about partnerships. So we'll go back around the room, this time in reverse order. So Beth, we'll start back with you again, but two-part question here. Based on your experiences, particularly with finding partners in other countries, what advice do you have to offer our participants today on identifying and engaging with strong partners around the world? And then with your partners, how do you ensure that you can properly sell your combined experiences, whether that's in project management or finance or other relevant skills, impacts in the past? What skills do you need to have, and how do you present them successfully with your partners?
Okay, thank you. So I'm starting, right, Chris?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, so I think I would go back to the point that I was mentioning on the last question, which is being very honest with yourself about your expertise and what you have and what is missing, and then being sure that you know your partners and that your partners are also being very honest about their experience. I think, speaking particularly as, my experience in Haiti, And I see there are some other partners from Haiti on the call. Right now, we have a rapidly changing context that's make quite difficult to implement in. So we're looking for partners who are already established. We're looking for partners who have already proven their capacity, that have demonstrated evidence. So trying to create a sort of patchwork of skills, evidence, experience that line up to what USAID has asked for in the RFA or the opportunity. And then one other thing that I would mention is that, especially working perhaps with research partners, academic partners, and I know this was also already mentioned, but I'm just going to go back to it. We do sometimes have research partners who get a little bit, I'm going to say, attached to sort of an academic perspective, which is very important, and that's why we want to bring in your expertise. But we really need to make sure that when we're speaking with research partners, we work with them and they have the interest to sort of attach that to the local context and the practical application in the local context.
Thanks, Beth. Over for your comments, Arvin, particularly our relationship with Makerere on laser.
Yeah, speaking to the specific process for preparing for laser, we had to think carefully about choosing partners who would complement our strengths. And so we certainly had Indiana University, Catholic Relief Services, Notre Dame, and Makerere University. And for us, the partnership with Makerere University, sort of started when we were thinking, we were expecting, the RFA for laser to come out, maybe a year ahead. We sort of had a sense, and we realized that, a prior awardee, Makerere, led a prior award from the same program. And they were doing some really, really cutting edge work. And we reached out to them. We had a colleague from there visit us as well. And that set up a relationship, I think, that really proved extremely fruitful for us, because we are fortunate in laser that now we have Makerere University that led one of the very successful higher education solutions network in a prior round. And so all that wisdom and experience has built our capacity to be able to manage this award. I would say it was one of those critical things. Partnerships, without partnerships, it's not going to work. You need to partner with the best institutions, and they will show you the way.
Thanks, Arvin. And Matt and Maggie, I want to see if you have any closing thoughts on partnership. How can teams work to develop strong partnerships and then sell those partnerships to you?
I would just add really quickly that, the time to start building that relationship is not when you have something to actually apply for, right? Applying for something, either whether it's concept note or a full application or what it looks like, is a stressful time. That's not the day one to start building that relationship. And we can tell when we're reading applications on whether partners really know each other and trust each other or not. And that feeds into how successful a partnership will be and a project will be, because as Arvin said, that fundamental idea of the partnership and knowing and trusting each other goes into all of the work that you all do. The other thing is just a kind of application advice part is explain to us what each partner brings that's both united and unique. And you'd be surprised at how often we're trying to guess that. Why did they choose this partner, right? Why is this the group? What does each one bring that is together, and what is that each one brings that's different, and is kind of bringing in those different assets. Thanks.
Matt?
Yeah, I think Maggie really covered a lot what I was going to say as well. I think, just kind of honing in on it. I think we hear from a lot of organizations, well, I can do that, or I can do whatever, just tell me what you want me to do and I can do it. And, I think what we're looking for is, organizations to know themselves, know what they can do, and kind of be able to communicate and articulate that to us. I think, as Maggie highlighted, I think, when we're reviewing proposals from people, it's very clear when organizations don't really know themselves. They don't seem to really know USAID. They don't necessarily know how they're actually all going to work together. And I think, from managing different awards or projects. Oftentimes, if you see organizations kind of on paper can't articulate how they're going to work together, it becomes a bit of a disaster in the actual implementation. So I think we're really looking for organizations that, you know, can be very clear and concise about what their technical expertise is, sort of how they're going to manage different programs or activities. So I think what everyone covered is really great.
Wonderful. I think we'll move on to our last question now before we go to our audience Q&A. I know we've got a lot of good activity in the chat. For all our panelists, in terms of technical design, can you give some tips here for successful applications in terms of approach or framework or writing style, best practices for getting appropriate background documents, budget development? You know, what has worked for you, of course, Arvind and Beth, but then, you know, Matt and Maggie, what do you like to see? So Matt, we'll start off with you and go back around the room.
Yeah, I mean, I think just a couple of tips. I think, you know, the way USAID is always is focused on sort of like, what are the results and how are we going to get to those results? And so I think being clear about the results are, I think, really important. I think one of the things that USAID is always looking for is, you know, something we call sort of past performance. What is your experience doing this type of work previously? You know, can you demonstrate that previous experience, that you've done it and been successful at it? You know, kind of the challenges of working in these environments or challenges of implementing a program, so you've been able to overcome them. I think tell a really powerful story in it. And then I think the other, I think particularly for newer organizations, you know, USAID has its own unique culture, how we operate, how we talk. And I think oftentimes, you know, the best partners kind of like understand us, how we work, we kind of get to understand them. And so I think demonstrating that understanding of USAID, kind of who we are, how we operate, even how we talk, is really powerful. When you're, you know, reviewing a concept note or proposal, you're like, oh, that organization like totally gets us, you know, we're excited to work with them. And other times you're like, in a proposal, they're sort of going off into tangents or using language that, you know, isn't necessarily language that we use. So, you know, there's sort of a bit of a cultural understanding of USAID that you have to, I think, that is really helpful, I think, in incorporating into your proposal or activity. And then I think just my last comment, I'll just note, you know, one of the things that we do have within USAID is something called Country Development Cooperation Strategies, or CDCS documents. I'll drop a link to them in the chat box. So for every country we work in, we have sort of a long-term plan or strategy. These are like gold mines if you're planning on applying for funding. You know, it tells you what USAID's long-term goals and objectives are. It uses that language that we talked about. It talks about sort of the intended outcomes of where USAID wants to be, you know, in 5 years. And so really encourage you to kind of look at the CDCS documents, look at, you know, what we say for what we're planning on doing in Kenya, for example, and, you know, incorporate that into your solicitation. It's really helpful for us in helping to kind of make some of those connections.
Thanks, Matt. Maggie, any follow-up thoughts on technical design?
So I'm going to go with the actual how you apply and things like that part of this. You know, so many of you are educators in various ways and forms. Think of this as when students give you back exam papers, right? What you really want is for them to answer the question you asked in the space that's provided in a clear and concise way. This is when I was teaching, this was the same issue I had there. You know, I don't want to have to work to find your answer. And that applies both when you're grading exam papers and when you're reviewing applications. You'd be surprised at the number of applications that we get in that have not followed the instructions. And oftentimes following the instructions, if you don't, your application is just dismissed, right? Because you have to be within the page limits. You have to, you know, provide the requested information. You have to do those things. And we may not even as reviewers see applications that don't meet the minimum requirements for it. So it's not a thing on how well you did. It may not even get to reviewers unless you've done those. And so really pay attention to those things. And I highly suggest that, you know, when you're at the final stage of doing this, give the whole package and the instructions to someone who has not worked on it at all, and ask them to read just the instructions and see if you followed them. You would, I mean, it seems like it's obvious, but let me tell you, it is not. And it really will help make sure that like the reviewers that want to see your great technical ideas actually get to. Thanks.
Thanks, Maggie. Beth, over to you for what you know a practitioner wants to try to do in terms of technical design or advice you have.
So Yeah, so I just want to touch again on what Matt said in terms of reading the CDCS and any other strategy documents. I can tell you, perhaps I shouldn't say this in front of Matt and Maggie, but when we're working on a new proposal, I will just Google USAID. If it's a youth program again, USAID, Youth, Haiti, entrepreneurship, and then pull out language. I'm not saying I plagiarize the USAID documents at all, but like really try and reflect their language back at them. I think that is, as Matt's already said, it's just so important in making sure that you're speaking in a language that the reviewer understands. And then maybe from a more technical standpoint, one thing that I would like to mention, we've talked already about localization, but I think especially in terms of implementing in countries that, that perhaps you're not based in that country. If you're a research partner, for example, you really need to make sure that during that proposal development process, it's structured so that local partners and local leaders can participate. Just simply, for example, technology access, simple electricity, internet, if you want to do Zoom platforms, for example, making sure that local partners lead on their aspects of the design, because I really think that comes through in the final design. If you're writing a proposal, including their activities, so you want people to be really leading on the parts of the program that they are the experts at. Which again, it sounds simple, but I know in a lot of times with time crunch, sometimes language barriers, that gets put to the side. I would also highlight the need to have like some sort of a desk review or technical review from somebody outside of that core design team, and preferably somebody who understands the proposal process. Make sure that your proposal reads clearly and that responds to the RFA from the perspective of somebody who's not part of the design team. A lot of times when we're designing a proposal, we get so ingrained in it and we're so confident in our approach that we lose that perspective. So it's really helpful to have somebody external for technical review. And then one thing I think we haven't really touched on, but is obviously a critical part of your proposal submission, your budget development. Again, when you think about the difference between maybe an implementing partner and a research partner, or even a local partner, there's very different cost structures. There's very different approaches, but it of course depends on the type of procurement, as Matt said, but you really need to make sure that when you bring those together, that they're cohesive and that they work effectively within the USAID guidelines and requirements. So again, going back to that responsiveness. Sorry, there's one other thing that I just want to add. I apologize, Chris, if I'm speaking too much, but this is an area that I've spent a lot of time on. And that is having the technical information for your proposal. So obviously there's always a ton of information available. You need to do your desk research, but there's also, for not a lot of money and maybe not a lot of time, rapid assessments or doing that upfront data collection so that when you're writing your proposal, you demonstrate your specific technical capacity and understanding of the context. And that really helps to, as we were saying earlier, that really helps to show that your proposal responds to the gap and to the need that USAID is trying to respond to. So that's how I'll stop there.
Thank you, Beth. I know we want to move to audience Q&A. Arvin, can you help us wrap up on technical design in about 45 seconds?
Yeah, no, I would say certainly from a university perspective, our university, one of our values is innovation, core values of the university. So when we look at applications, we're always thinking, even in more cooperative agreements, with very, very specific goals, we try to look for space for innovation in laser, for example, how do we figure out what the key research questions are? Is there a science behind translating policy and impact? So these are things we try to highlight in our application, at least in the laser side. But broadly speaking, I would just re-emphasize what Maggie brought up, is studying the RFA or the NOFO really, really well is key. There's a reason why all people have put in a lot of work into putting those details in. In fact, you'd be surprised if you put 2 or 3 different people to work on looking at one of these RFAs and using highlighter marker pens to kind of highlight, you bring them together, each one will say they saw something else, right? It just goes to show that even when you read such a big document, not everyone is internalizing all the key facts. So even there, you need multiple people looking at very many facets of the RFA, and to make sure that someone is addressing all those parts. All right, there's good reasons why they're there the way they are. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're going to be participating in or bidding for a program that's being rebid, that there's already a previous version of it and they're rebidding a new one, you might want to look at the midterm review report from USAID regarding the previous project. That'll give you some insight into learning from what seems to work, what are strategies, so you can learn from someone else's successes and mistakes as well. So I would recommend that as well. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists for working through this overview. Harriet, I'd like to turn it over to you to see what questions that we have from the audience that we can get addressed in the final 8 minutes or so we have today.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and thank you, our panelists. We have about 6 questions. Good enough, some of the panelists have been responding real time in the chat room, and thank you for that. Question 1, I think would go to Dr. Linak. Can USAID work with universities directly without going through governments? For example, working directly with Ministry of Education in Kenya? Maggie,
yes,
Maggie, you also have a second question. I could give you the 2.
Give me them both.
Thank you. It goes partnerships between US-based institutions and other institutions seems to be at the heart of USAID funding. Why is this often the case? Over to you, Maggie. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for both these questions, and thanks, Harriet. Yes, we often work directly with HEIs, both in the US and in countries all around the world directly. So we have a either prime or sub-award relationship with not going through the government entity, but directly to the higher education partner. In fact, it's often easier to try to do it that way than going through a government partner, because every time you add a partner, you add a level of bureaucracy. And so, making those relationships where they're legally available, and that's not all countries, but where they're legally available is usually a strong way for us to partner. The second question is partnerships between US and developing country institutions. It's not a requirement, but we are seeing more of that. Some of that comes from the types of money that we are able to access to fund these programs, and that comes from the US Congress. And so because we have US, inherently stakeholders, and Congress is funding these programs, we often see either suggestions or requirements that there is a US partner and a developing country partner involved in the process. The other thing, and as we move towards, but you will see that we often do not dictate who needs to be the prime in that relationship. So who is the direct relationship with USAID and who is the sub-awardee under that? We have many partnerships where either the US country institution is the prime or the developing country institution is the prime, and we often give no preference one way or the other. We do find, though, because especially working in higher education institutions, inherently, and I'm a scientist by training, inherently in our work is this idea of international partnership. And so I think you also are seeing and feeling some of that call for international partnership really coming through, because that's how science grows. That's how research grows. And so, being able to make those connections through a formal, MOU type partnership is one way that we can ensure that happens, and that research doesn't stay kind of in its own country and has a chance to kind of spread and grow and have more impact. But thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Maggie. and these go to Matt. After the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects, how has this changed USAID's high impact group focus and strategy? But I have two for you, Matt, so I would request that I go through the second one too. It reads, is there funding available from USAID partners for epidemiology or clinical research or other public health related courses? Thank you, and over to you, Matt.
Yeah, so on the last question about funding for research and health, so the bulk of our funding within USAID is actually health-related funding, most of it going to AIDS work around the world. But so there are just a ton of opportunities around the world within sort of our global health portfolio. You can see, if you go to our business forecast, or even go to USAID.gov, you can see all the different areas that we are working kind of in the global health space. You know, with COVID-19, I feel like there were some good shifts in how we operated. I think we released like a toolkit on sort of how to do monitoring and evaluation and learning kind of from a distance perspective. I think, you know, there was a really focus on who are we partnering with and how are we partnering with the local organizations in many circumstances. You know, what happened in many places, you know, when COVID-19 hit, is all of the Americans kind of came back to the United States, and then suddenly, like, all of our programs, the people that are actually there implementing the activities still are, you know, all the local staff. And so I think sort of how we evaluate, how we even deliver some of our programs and assistance has shifted, I think, in a positive way with COVID-19. So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, thank you, Matt. And we have another question for Beth. Beth, it reads, there should be some space to allow for interaction with portfolio officers of specific regions or countries in co-creating processes. This particular person who asked says she often hears that country officers do not have significant time to interact or even connect. How do we mitigate that? Over to you, Beth. Thank you.
Yeah, so that question's about country officers from USAID, from the USAID mission team, I think, yeah. And that is true. They are very busy. And I think that gets back to what Matt was saying, and I think Arvin touched on this also, reaching out to them, not when the opportunity drops, but ahead of time, building those relationships, taking advantage of the missions activities where they'll participate in panels, or like this one at the country program level, or they'll have other types of outreach activities, and building those relationships prior to that opportunity coming out, and being able to then leverage those once you need more specific information on a published opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Beth.
If I could just add maybe a couple kind of, concrete things with it. So I think we've talked a little bit about this, but I think the term we call kind of co-creation of when we engage with organizations, and that's most specifically kind of focusing on sort of like the partnership process. But if you look at our business forecast, or you look at different activities, there's a lot of ways that we try and solicit feedback. So we do industry days. It'll be announced, on grants.gov, where we invite everyone in. We talk about the program activity, we get feedback. We'll oftentimes share draft scopes of work, or we'll issue something called a sources sought notice, where we basically are trying to identify sort of who out there in the universe is working in some of these areas. And so if you go on grants.gov or sam.gov, or even if you look at our business forecast, we actually have a co-creation field that talks about, we identify sort of how we're going to co-create with organizations on every program and activity. That's been a major focus and shift within the agency over the last couple of years. I think last year, I think 30% of all new funding had some level of engagement with program officers, technical officers, sort of before a funding opportunity was released. And I anticipate that it would increase this coming year as well. So.
Okay, thank you, Matt. And back to you, Chris. I must note that we have a few more questions, but I can see we are at the top of the hour. Back to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. We'll try to get any questions that were not addressed today addressed in potentially a follow-up email to all of our participants so that you can receive some additional answers to your questions. I wanted everybody to join me in giving a very warm thank you to all of our panelists for their insightful answers to my questions, your questions, giving us all a great overview about how to effectively apply for USAID grants. Thank you, everybody. And we'll hopefully see you all next time. I dropped a link in the chat. Please join us on September 14th for an event on once you've applied and potentially won a grant, how do you manage it well? So hopefully we can see you all there September 14th. Thank you all and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. And